Privyet moi druzy. That's Ukrainian in a really bad accent saying hello, my friends. Welcome. It is day 344. My name is Darren Gerdes, and I'm a professor who goes through the news and tries to unpack what's going on, tries to help you see behind the headlines. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're going to talk about some viewer comments, corruption, and how the corruption changes that have happened this week are tied to EU membership. We talk about Wagner's woes and give you a sense of what it's actually been like for Wagner. We'll talk about Boris Johnson visiting the U.S., how Russians lack empathy for Ukraine. This is just part of their culture, part of the way that the Russian populace has functioned, and why they're not going to rise up and overthrow Putin anytime soon. Congress was briefed on retaking Crimea, and I will tell you what the results of that were. And then finally, we'll have Trump, a video of Trump talking about how Ukraine never would have happened if he was in power. And then we'll have some fun with Russian state media. Thank you for being here and thank you for listening to this. I know you could be doing many other things. So we're going to look at some viewer comments first. Sorokin, yesterday I talked about an article where he compared Russia to a zombie version of the Soviet Union coming back to life. Sorokin insults zombies everywhere, comparing them to Russia. You can at least trust a zombie. They just want your brain straight up, no lies or deception, very honest and open. So not like Russia at all. Okay. Cheryl said that she's mentioned me in other forums, in chats, as being a pro-Ukraine Republican. That's exactly what I am. I'm a Reagan Republican. And the question to my mind was, like, if Ronald Reagan was confronted with this right now, his question wouldn't be, can we provide that, or will Russia be upset with us? His question would be like, how many arms can Ukraine handle? Like, how can we make sure that they have enough to take this fight to the Russians? Mats Larson said comparing corruption in today's Russia with that in Soviet Union is simplifying it too much, in my opinion. During the Soviet time, you could bribe an official with a ballpoint pen, a commercial sticker, or a few oranges. I don't think that will get you anywhere today. That's right. It's a lot worse. Now, that corruption has also spilled over into the whole neighborhood. Wherever the Soviet Union had been, there were vestiges of corruption. And so you see that in Ukraine. Somebody, and I couldn't find the comment here again, it was, I think, Mr. Wright said this. He said, thank you for actually taking on the corruption issue. I know Ukrainians don't want to hear about the corruption, but it's actually really important that we address this, because Zelensky is dealing with these issues of corruption. And right now, he has to root this out, or he's not going to get into the EU. And getting into the EU is the big thing. So here's Ukraine's anti-corruption searches reveal luxury watches, cars, thousands of dollars in cash, and it's really terrible what some of these people have done to line their own pockets. Among those caught up in the investigations is the acting head of the Kyiv Tax Authority, who is allegedly part of a scheme who overlooked 45 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, $1.2 billion in unpaid taxes. So they've got to root this kind of thing out. This is really, really bad. Another article, that was CNN, another article in The Guardian covers the same kind of stuff, and they really have to do something about this. A number of Ukrainian officials have been forced to resign last week amid allegations of corruption, as Zelensky pledged that practices that were widespread before the war in Ukraine would not be allowed to continue. That's right. That's exactly the right tack, and he's doing what he needs to do. Now, as mentioned this yesterday, I was talking to a Russian troll who was saying, "Where are the trials for corruption? See how Ukraine is corrupt? Look, they're firing these guys. If a trial comes later, it'll come later. They have other priorities, but they're firing them, taking decisive action right now, and that's what they need to be doing." Here's another article about the same kind of thing. Well, how it leads to the next step in the puzzle, which is 15 European commissioners headed by the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, have arrived in Kyiv. And the visit of the college is a strong symbol of the Commission's support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified aggression. Now, how is that connected? Because they're wiping out corruption and putting in measures and putting in laws and features in place so that they align with the European Union, so that they can become part of the European Union, which will give them strength against Russia as soon as they can join it. EU membership, no shortcuts on joining, officials warn ahead of the summit. So they're there. The long and short of this is we're here to show you that we're supporting you. Prime Minister Schmigel said that their plan is to join within 2 years. It's a very ambitious goal. There are some that have started 20 years ago and still have not yet joined because they haven't gotten their house in order yet. But let me scroll down to the end. I think this is right. Senior officials say Ukraine's future membership is not in doubt, but no one is willing to spell out an exact time frame because they have to get all the pieces in place. We will do it, but there are no shortcuts, said one diplomat, and I think that's actually the right approach for EU, but Ukraine has to really hustle in order to get these things in place, and the corruption needs to be rooted out at all kinds of levels. Zelensky came in as a fighter against corruption. Now, he didn't get everything that he was trying to get, but his servant of the people party was anti corruption. And he had a lot of roadblocks and impediments in place. But as we know, the war is allowing him to make moves and changes that he otherwise wouldn't have been able to do before this. I thank all law enforcement officials who have demonstrated the power of law and the power of the state today. I'm grateful to the government of Ukraine for its prompt personnel response. In particular, today, the heads of the Customs Service were dismissed. I've been informed that disciplinary proceedings have been initiated against some of those dismissed. So there are some trials, to my Russian troll friend. There are some trials coming down the line. Unfortunately, in some spheres, the only way to guarantee legitimacy is to change leaders. That's right. That's true in just general business as well. Sometimes the only way to make a change is to actually change the person in place because personnel is policy. Along with institutional change is implementation. Change as much as necessary to ensure that people do not abuse power. And that's exactly what they have to do. Okay, let me shift gears from that corruption issue to Wagner. Wagner has been a very, just a fascinating thing, the Wagner Group. There was so Solidar was largely a Wagner effort, and Wagner was trying to take all the credit for it, and the Russian military was trying to take the credit away from Wagner because there's some infighting. But I saw a report about this before, but this is really, really fascinating. This CNN headline here. Okay, fighting Wagner is like a zombie movie, said one Ukrainian soldier who was just outside Bakhmut. They came under attack by a flood of Wagner fighters. We were fighting for about 10 hours in a row, and it wasn't just like it was just waves. It was uninterrupted. So it was just like they didn't stop coming. Their AK-47 rifles became so hot from constant firing, he said, that they had to keep changing them. It was about 20 soldiers on our side and let's say 200 from their side. Like they just kept coming. So they're swarming in waves. Now I've seen other corroborating evidence that this was how it was done. Andre compares the battle to a scene out of a zombie movie. They're climbing above the corpse of their friends, stepping on them, he said. It looks like very, very likely that they're getting some drugs before the attack. Now, that's really interesting. If that is the case, I mean, like, they're not really sensitive to that individual has rights. They're just throwing this mass of bodies at them, hoping they can make a dent. And so the ISW kind of corroborates that this is how not just Wagner, but the Russian military is fighting because they don't have the artillery anymore to be able to do what they were once doing. What they used to do is they would just destroy an entire city with artillery and then go through the rubble. That doesn't work anymore when you don't have the artillery. Russia's intention of conducting a decisive offensive operation in Donbass in February and March, supporting the ISW's most likely course of action. So they're planning on coming, but how will they come? Ukrainian main military intelligence directorate representatives said that the poor state of Russian military equipment will force the Russian military command to mass forces to outnumber Ukrainian defenders in order to make gains. Very much like what you saw with Wagner. Okay, there is one other thing in this ISW report that I found really, really interesting. That infighting between Prigozhin and Gherkin and the Russian military, it's like this weird hate triangle. And so let me read about this and then I'll try to explain it. The Kremlin is likely seizing an opportunity to discredit Igor Gherkin, a prominent critical voice within Russian nationalist space and former Russian officer following his altercation with Wagner Group financier Prigozhin. Russian propagandist Vladimir Solovov accused Gherkin of cowardice following his decision to retreat from Sloviansk Donetsk Oblast in 2014. And this is an ongoing thing that Gherkin's been smeared with. But the ISW previously assessed that Prigozhin's criticism of Gherkin will likely benefit the Kremlin, who will seize this opportunity to discredit an avid critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Okay, so this will also kind of inflate Prigozhin's stock a little bit while it's taking down Gherkin. But I want this fight to go on for a long time. I want the dysfunction to remain between the Russian military, between Prigozhin, between the mill bloggers like Gherkin. I want it to go on because this dysfunction makes it extra hard for them to do what they're trying to do. In the meantime, I saw this 2 days ago and I thought, oh, let me bring that one out. This Defense Ministry Intelligence Agency, Prigozhin does not lead Wagner HQ. He's just a front man. He's just like the face of it, but he doesn't actually lead in the fight. Russian oligarch Prigozhin does not lead Wagner headquarters and performs only a media function. But you would never have known that if you were looking at his photos with his men. See what we've taken. So that Prigozhin's he's a paper tiger, and he'll be happy to climb all the way to the top on the backs of dead fallen soldiers. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson came to the United States. I only knew this because I let Fox News run a little bit too long yesterday, and it spilled into Tucker Carlson, which I usually just turn off. But he was talking about Boris Johnson, ditched Tucker's show yesterday once he realized who Tucker Carlson was. And then he, badmouthed Tucker, and Tucker showed him bad-mouthing him on his own show. But good for Boris. Tucker drank the Kool-Aid, and shame on him. Boris Johnson has confronted the U.S. Republican skepticism about providing more arms to Ukraine, saying that it was time to give Kyiv the tools, including F-16s, to reclaim the land taken by Putin since February 24th. Johnson also used a speech at the Atlantic Council think tank, TV appearances, and an article in the Washington Post and his meetings with senior Republican senators to try to stiffen U.S. resolve. Good on him. Honestly, I saw when Boris Johnson was the first foreign leader in Ukraine, he was the leader of the free world in supporting Ukraine. And good on him. For whatever other issues Boris Johnson might have, he's an interesting cat. He has been Ukraine's best friend, and I congratulate him for that. America's contribution is noble and huge, Johnson said, but it's still only 5 to 6% of the U.S. Annual U.S. defense budget so far, and has helped to degrade about 20%, some say 50%, of Putin's war machine. This is exactly what Ben Shapiro said. I showed you this about a month ago. Ben Shapiro saying exactly the same kind of thing. So I'm glad that Boris is going on this tour, making this pitch, because Republicans need to not be just imbibing this Russian propaganda, and it's amazing to me to see where that divide is. And generally, conservatives, Reagan conservatives like myself, tend to side with Ukraine, and other conservatives, like more populist conservatives, tend to follow more of a Russian line, and that's kind of brought through by Trump. And now Trump's an interesting cat. We're going to talk about him in just a little bit as well, because he says this never would have happened. Just stay tuned. I'll get to that in about 3 articles. Okay, so I'm only going to look at the headline here, but Western weapons deliveries in a race against Russian offensive. That's right. That offensive is coming, and we know that the offensive's coming. We know that an important date is coming. February 24th is right around the corner. Okay, that's the 1-year date, and I think the Russians want to have something to show for this. They may attack in February, they may attack in March, whatever. But tanks, most of these tanks aren't getting to the battlefield until March, maybe April, sometimes even May. And so there is a legitimate race of weapons against this Russian offensive. Okay, let me shift gears again. This was absolutely fascinating, this article here. It was Europe's Last Empire, Putin's Ukraine war exposes Russia's imperial identity. Now, it's not so much about the imperial stuff, it's just about the average Russian. Russians have gotten out of the country, but they haven't really protested against Russia wherever they've gone. They've gotten out because they were like, I don't want to have any part of this. I appreciate that. I say get out. I know other people will say, no, you stay in there and you oppose the regime. I don't think the mentality in Russia will allow for them to actually oppose the regime. And here's what I said. This is evidence that confirms my position. Much of the available evidence supports that these poll findings and points to a remarkable absence of empathy within Russia. Like the Russian people have just been like beaten down. There's beyond the Soviet times, they like kept with this like just like if you're not political, you get to keep your stuff, but once you get political, you're going to have problems. Hundreds of thousands of Russians who fled the country over the past year have not staged any major anti-war rallies while in exile, despite no longer being subject to draconian Kremlin restrictions. Now, I'm not saying that it's good that they're doing this. It's good that they got out. It's good for them. It's good that they've bled the manpower of Russia by just getting out. I would like them to have empathy, but they don't. And because they don't, and I understand, I'm dealing with what is, not with what I would want them to do. Okay. But because I don't expect them to rise up and overthrow Putin either. And that's really what we need to understand. This apparent lack of empathy for the victims of Russian imperial aggression is nothing new. Many Russians displayed similar attitudes toward the two Chechen wars in the early post-Soviet era and in the 2008 invasion of Georgia. And so I think for those reasons, you're not going to see any real shift. Like the Russian people, like when you interview, what is it, 1420, when they interview people in Russia, they're like, I mean, this happens everywhere. I mean, people fall out of buildings. It's just, they fall out of buildings when they oppose. They do that in America too. Like, okay, not really, or at least not nearly to that degree, but that's where they are. Okay, another article. This is shifting gears again. The Congress's assessment of what's going to happen in Crimea or what can happen in Crimea was really telling. Okay, this article is in Politico. Ukraine can't retake Crimea soon. Pentagon tells lawmakers in classified briefing. Wow. Okay, so how the classified briefing is leaking, that's a whole different story. But Ukrainian forces are unable to recapture Crimea from Russian troops in the near future, four senior Defense Department officials told House Armed Services Committee lawmakers in a classified briefing. I think there's probably something to it. It's going to be logistically very hard, and they don't have quite the weapons that they should have to do that. But this only confirms what General Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs Chair, talked about a few weeks ago. He says, I still maintain that for this year, it would be very, very difficult to militarily eject Russian forces from every inch of Ukraine and Russian occupied Ukraine. He said during a meeting in January 20th, that doesn't mean it can't happen. Okay, it doesn't mean it won't happen, but it will be very, very difficult. Now, I hate that. I'm all in for Ukraine. I want Ukraine to succeed, but on January 1st, I said, look, I don't think it's going to be done this year. I want it to be done this year, but I don't think it will be done this year. Okay, let's talk about a different question, and that is, would this have ever happened if Donald Trump was in power? So, conservatives and liberals tend to be very split about this. Liberals think, oh, Trump would have just rolled over and given Putin anything he wanted. Conservatives, oddly, they tell me something very different. They say Trump would never have let it happen. Now, just bear with me for a moment before you go, no, that's not true. Listen, Trump, we can all agree that Trump has a huge ego, right? Trump, I don't think, like in the way that he dealt with North Korea, same kind of thing. Like, okay, Rocket Man, you ready for it? I'm bringing it. I don't think he would have allowed Putin to do that. I also think that for whatever reasons, the way that we left Afghanistan was terrible, and it encouraged Putin to do what he did. So just listen to Trump, what he has to say here, because he's saying that Ukraine never would have happened, and we can't know. It's counterfactual to think that we're going to actually know what has happened here. We just can't. Okay, but listen to Trump's argument.
If I were president, the Russia-Ukraine war would never have happened.
Never have happened. Now, see, so again, and this is what my conservative friends tend to tell me. That's how they see the world. Whether you believe them or not, I'm just telling you that's how we think.
Million years. But even now, if I were president, I'd be able to negotiate an end to this horrible and rapidly escalating war.
Now, the question is, how would he negotiate? Would he negotiate by giving stuff away, or would he negotiate by threatening? Now, his whole MO has been more of a peace through strength kind of thing, before, and I'm going to make them. I remember before he was president, him saying something like, "We should have the toughest negotiators. They should be wondering if they're going to be nuked." And I'm thinking, like, I think that's the way he would have approached this. Now, I don't know if he could do that right now, but I think that's the way he would have approached it before. I could be wrong. Correct me. Put in your comments whatever you think. This is what I think, and tell me in your comments. I am on the left side of the spectrum, and I think this. I'm on the right side of the spectrum, and I think this. That way we can see how the different sides think.
Within 24 hours, it can be done. You have to say the right things, not the wrong things. I think we helped lead Russia into that war by saying, well, if they took a small part of the country, that would be okay.
Yeah, and I think that we have encouraged Russia unnecessarily by not doing anything in 2008, by not doing anything in 2014, by the way that we left Afghanistan, so on and so forth.
Such a tragic waste of human life when you look at all that's happening there. Those cities are obliterated. First comes the tanks, and then come the nukes. Get this crazy war ended now. It can.
Okay, first come the tanks, then come the nukes. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean that first come the tanks, oh, Russia's going to nuke us? Or does that mean we're going to bring the nukes? I can't really tell. It's a little opaque. And I think he's maybe trying to be opaque. I can't tell exactly where he is with this. But okay, that was Trump on whether it would have happened if it was under his watch. What we do know about Trump is that he has a huge ego, and I think for that reason, there might be something to my political side's argument about that, but nonetheless, whatever it is. And by the way, don't leave this channel just because I'm a Republican. Like, if you are a conservative, great. If you're a liberal, great. If you're independent, great. If you support Ukraine, this is where you belong. Okay, let me go on to some fun with Russian state media. Okay, so the first article said this conflict will fundamentally change Russia. A young Muscovite explains why he volunteered in the fight. This is propaganda. It's the Gerasimov doctrine writ large. So this guy, he's fighting for the Donbas militia. And why did he fight for the Donbas militia? Well, I seriously considered going to Donbas 8 years ago when the conflict had just begun. February 24th, a new round of this conflict began. I was first eager to go to the front as a war correspondent. But in 2014, you felt that you didn't need to fight in this conflict. Why did your opinion change? Well, the situation is different now. In February, it seemed that the Russian leadership had finally come to the conclusion that the Ukrainian issue needed to be resolved abruptly and definitively. It was impossible for me to stay away. And you didn't see another role for yourself other than the servicemen? I managed to go to the front line for 3 days to work with a drone there, and I got a taste for the job, and I realized I liked it, and I wanted to do it. I mean, like, what a puff piece, right? Okay, why did you decide to volunteer for the People's Militia of the DPR and not the Russian Armed Forces? Until last year, the Russian Armed Forces weren't taking part in the conflict in Donbass. And why did you not consider serving in PMC, for example, the Wagner Group? I thought about it, but then certain ideological issues arose. Personally, I wanted some continuity with a centuries old history of the Russian army. Wagner is a new model. In addition, I wouldn't really like to serve in a PMC from an epistemic, aesthetic, or ethical point of view. What? I mean, right? So it's kind of slamming Wagner in the same time while it's doing this. And this is a Russian state media controlled station in RT. I personally think that the eclectic nature of the ongoing conflict makes it more fun. Our people's militias have an inexhaustible supply of fighting spirit. These guys just can't retreat. They're not fighting for some overseas colonies. It's not a matter of playing an exciting military game. Everyone knows that if they back down today, their families will be killed or abused, right? Because, Ukraine's the boogeyman. Okay, enough with that one. It's just a puff piece. It's part of the Gerasimov doctrine of 4-to-1 emphasis on other extra military to military. If you're not familiar with that, I talked about that in previous episodes. Lavrov identifies the root of U.S.-Russia tensions. And what is it? Well, it's the U.S. being bad. Being bad by claiming to be exceptional. The root cause of the conflict in Ukraine is linked to Washington's belief that the U.S. is exceptional and the contention that this supposedly justifies its dominance. But the U.S.'s dominance has nothing to do with you invading Ukraine. Just like they melted in a pot everyone who arrived in America, they now want to melt everyone else. So they essentially become Americans, the minister said. This is exceptionalism. This is absolute conviction of their infallibility and superiority. I am certain that it's the main reason why we are now confronting the nations that waged a proxy war against us through the Kiev regime. Wait a minute. So Kiev is attacking you through NATO because of American exceptionalism? Like, but this is RT, and this is what people are imbibing, like this guy who is now fighting in the war in Ukraine. Okay, so that's what you have to understand. Okay, another article, Why Latin America is a Single Currency Could Mean for the US Dollar. They love getting away from the US dollar as the world currency. Why is the US dollar the world currency? Well, it's a world currency because after World War II, the accords after World War II made the US dollar the official trading currency. You buy your goods in this US dollars and you sell in US dollars. And that way, if your countries do stupid stuff, like we're not exactly the greatest at not inflating our currency or whatever, I get that. But other countries, by and large, are worse. Not all, but I mean, outside of Europe, in Europe, they tend to do a little bit better, particularly in England. Um, but by and large, most other countries. So it's a safe, trading means, and you could use gold just as well. That would work. But that's why they do what they do. But they want to get away from that because they want to upend. The Russians really want to upend the international world order, and go from a what they call a unipolar world dominated by the U.S. and Europe to a bipolar world, which is more like what the U.S. and Soviet Union, U.S. led West, and the Soviet Union were like 30, 40 years ago. Okay, next, last RT article. Russia outlines its response if Ukraine gets longer range weapons. And what will that be? Well, Ukraine forces will be pushed further back from Russian territories in response to the West's decision to provide Kyiv with longer range weapons. Well, if you could do that, why wouldn't you just do that right now? Like, why wouldn't you just do it as it is? Now, our goal is to push the artillery of the Ukrainian armed forces back to a distance where they would not be able to create a threat to our territories. Really? That's your response? Okay, well, I mean, what your response actually will be is that you're going to move your supply lines back so that they're not in danger anymore because they're going to be destroyed. Okay, at any rate, that's all that I had, and thank you for caring about Ukraine. I want to leave you with this because Russia has gloriously attacked this building that was apparently threatening it for some reason I don't quite understand, and this is where we are. This was a residential building in Kramatorsk, and there was no military threat, no military reason, and this is what they do. I want to leave you with that visual image. Thank you for your time. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Hope you're back. I'll be back for sure.